Good evening.
Central Park lunch, and then I go right to the airport.
I'm Chris Silver. I'm the Dean of the College of Design, Construction, and Planning. And my small task tonight was to give our speaker a warm welcome. And as you can tell outside, I did the warm part real well. But you did the real welcome part, because it's a great turnout for what I think will be a terrific lecture this evening. David and I are old friends, and so it's a real pleasure to have him join us here at the University of Florida. In fact, we're even older friends than even he and I knew, because as we found out, we both grew up in the Hudson Valley area. He was actually on the Hudson River. I was on that smaller Mohawk River that connected to it. We both did our master's degrees at the University of North Carolina in history. I didn't know him then. He was a young guy, despite the gray hair. Anyway, but we got to know each other quite well through the Society for American City and Regional Planning History. But I actually knew him beforehand because he wrote a great book, really the book, on the new urban landscape that really sort of tied Frederick Law Olmsted into the whole origin of planning in the United States. And even if you're not that interested in the planning history part, but you're interested in how our landscapes developed and the ideas that developed and some really good suburban development in the 19th century, look at the new urban landscape. It's a really terrific book. He's also going to be presenting, I'll do a little plug for tomorrow morning, he is going to be giving an informal conversation over in our architecture gallery in the architecture building at 9 o'clock for about an hour, hour and a half, about his brand new book on a totally different subject but related to the Hudson Valley. It's called Sanctified Landscapes, and it really looks at the writers, the artists, the designers, all of the folks who celebrated, worshipped, and then to some extent watched the Hudson Valley not get destroyed, but certainly get tainted by industrialization and the developments of the 20th century. So he'll be talking about that tomorrow morning over in the architecture gallery, which is on the ground level floor in the architecture building, room 222. So if you're able to stop over, I think you'll enjoy that as well. But for tonight, let me turn it over to our host, Bonnie.
Good evening and welcome. Many of you are familiar faces, but for those of you who are coming for the first time tonight, my name is Bonnie Efros, and I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the second lecture of our semester for the series called Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. And as many of you know, this is a long-term project. We had 8 lectures last year, and we'll have another 2 this semester. And we are hoping next semester to follow it with a series of roundtables that relates more directly to the history of the University of Florida as well as the state of Florida. So please help yourself to flyers. We've got them there near the door, and we also have a sign-up sheet for those of you who'd like to be on our mailing list. For those of you who've been to our previous lectures, you know that our speakers have talked about the hallmarks and contributions of the humanities to the past, present, and future of higher education. And tonight's lecture by Professor Schuyler addresses the ambitions and goals of university founders and campus designers and how these were expressed in the choices they made in the layout of university campuses in the United States. The contributions of landscape architects like Frederick Law Olmsted were particularly important in shaping both the image and standards of higher education, including at the University of Florida campus, where, as some of you may know, Olmsted's sons were responsible for designing the Plaza of the Americas and a number of other structures here on campus. And I hope that after the lecture is concluded, if you haven't seen the material already on the table in the back, we are very grateful to the university archivist, Peggy McBride, who's taken out some of the documents that relate to the planning of the University of Florida, dating back to the teens and the 1920s. And so I want to thank her. She's there in the back. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions. We're very grateful for this chance to learn more about our own institution. And before making a more formal introduction to Professor Schuyler, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the sponsorship of the many entities and organizations here on campus that have made tonight's event possible. And if I remember, here we go. I don't have to list them all, thankfully. And so I want to thank all of our many co-sponsors here on campus as well as in Gainesville, particularly the Alachua County Library District, who've helped make tonight's events possible. And I also, of course, want to thank Sophia Akerd, Matt Delvaux, Debbie Whalen, Althea Geiger, and Nazanin Akhtar for helping to prepare for this lecture this evening. And now, at last, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Professor David Schuyler, who received his PhD in history from Columbia University. He's currently the Arthur and Catherine Shadick Professor of the Humanities and Professor of American Studies at Franklin and Marshall College, where he's taught since 1979. Professor Schuyler is the author of many works, and we've heard about some of them already. I'll list a few of his books: A City Transformed, Redevelopment, Race, and Suburbanization in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1940 to 1980. Apostle of Taste, Andrew Jackson Downing, 1815 to 1852. The New Urban Landscape, which we already heard about, the redefinition of city form in 19th century America. And most recently, of course, Sanctified Landscape, Writers, Artists, and the Hudson River Valley, 1820 to 1909, and that just came out this year with Cornell University Press. He's also a co-editor of many volumes, including From Garden City to Green City, The Legacy of Ebenezer Howard, and probably most famously as co-editor of 3 volumes of the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers, the most recent for which he was the editor, called The Years of Olmsted, Vaux and Company, 1865 to 1874. And he's now, if I understand correctly, the director of the entire project, or the, okay. Okay, so, Professor Schuyler is also the associate editor of the Journal of Planning History, a member of the editorial board of the Hudson River Valley Review and the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, and as I mentioned incorrectly, the chair of the editorial board of the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers publication project. He's the editor of an award-winning Creating the North American Landscape series at the Johns Hopkins University Press, and he served as chair or member of the board of a number of very important historic societies. He's the past president of the Society for American City and Regional Planning History and a trustee of the New York Academy of History. He's won many distinguished teaching awards, and I don't want to cut into his time any longer, so I hope that you'll join me in welcoming him for his talk this evening. His talk is entitled Civilizing Students, Civilizing Communities, Frederick Law Olmsted's Plans for Colleges and Universities.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, Chris, and thank you all for coming, and especially Peggy, thank you for bringing down those plans. I had not seen them before, and they're part of a legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted's, because his firm remained active into the 1960s. His son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who's probably the person who is on the point for those plans, died in 1957, and he basically started winding down at the end of the Great Depression, but he continued to be the principal in the firm until 1950. And when he died, it was exactly a centennial to the year of his father's appointment as superintendent of labor at Central Park. So it's a remarkable legacy, and Gator Nation is very much a part of it. This is Fred Olmsted, and I've been working on Olmsted since 1975, so we're on a first-name basis by now. But in 1865, Olmsted's career was at a decisive point. He and Calvert Vaux had been co-designers, and Olmsted was architect-in-chief and superintendent of Central Park from 1858 to 1861. When the Civil War broke out, he became General Secretary, really the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Sanitary Commission. And this was a remarkable organization that attempted to promote healthier planning for the Army, sanitary organization of campgrounds and other things, and a better provisioning of medical service for Union troops during the Civil War. He basically was burned out both of the incredible schedule he was keeping and also tired of butting heads with his administrators, his trustees. And so in 1863 he went to California and he spent 2 years managing the vast Mariposa gold mine. And it was there that he became the first chairman of the Yosemite Commission and guided Yosemite into what becomes the first really national park. But in 1865 he returns east and he's really not quite sure about his profession. Calvert Vaux has secured the appointment to design Prospect Park and maybe get some work on Central Park again, although that never happens. He angles for the position of heading the Freedmen's Bureau. He thinks that it's his true calling in life to aid the transition of the former slaves to freedom. But that doesn't pan out. So he begins spending a lot of time in the editorial offices of The Nation, a magazine that's founded along ideas that he very clearly sketched in 1863 in the hope of influencing national opinion during the Reconstruction and beyond period. But despite continuing frustrations with the Board of Commissioners of the Central Park, he decides that his profession is indeed in landscape architecture. And one topic that really commanded his attention immediately was the design of the new land-grant colleges created under provision of the Morrill Act. And I'm happy to be here because Bonnie has organized this symposium in part as a celebration of the 150th, the sesquicentennial of the passage of the Morrill Act. And the University of Florida is the state's land-grant college. And so you have much to be proud of, and I take real pleasure in talking about the history of land-grant colleges to you. The Morrill Act was more formally known as an act donating public land to the states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. And it took its name from its sponsor, Vermont Senator Justin Smith Morrill. It was passed by each House of Congress in June 1862 and signed by President Abraham Lincoln on July 2nd, 1862. Now, the Morrill Act didn't come out of thin air. It came out of deep and long-standing concerns among Easterners that agriculture was a declining industry in the East. And also, because agriculture was declining, that many of the children of the farming areas were leaving and migrating to cities. So many areas in New England and upstate New York were experiencing depopulation as Eastern farms came into greater competition with Midwestern farms, now accessible to Eastern markets first by canals and then by railroads. And so those much more fertile farmlands out across the Appalachian Mountains begin putting New England farmers and many farmers in the Hudson Valley out of work. Solon Robinson, who was an Indiana agricultural reformer, visited Westchester County, New York, and Fairfield County, Connecticut in the late 1840s, and he was just absolutely appalled by what he saw. He equated agricultural practices in the East with that old Whig American system, which was an attempt to promote economic development through internal improvements in manufacturing. But in his case, what he called the American system of agriculture was shave skin and destroy the soil. And a whole bunch of people who were concerned about the state of agriculture began thinking in terms of better education as the solution. And one of the first and most important of these was Andrew Jackson Downing. He was a horticulturist and landscape gardener, and he was born in Newburgh, New York, which is my hometown, and sort of how I got interested in this stuff, because I, growing up, knew nothing about him, of course. I played in Downing Park, and it never occurred to me to ask who he was, and nobody ever thought it was important enough to tell me. So I went through the whole public school system in Newburgh, New York, and I never knew a thing about its most famous citizen. And I thought, I got to do something about that. But one of the things that concerned Downing was that the productivity of farmland in the Hudson Valley was declining dramatically. He pointed out that, for example, only 10 years earlier, farms in the Hudson Valley were generating about 40 bushels of wheat per acre, but that any farm that had been in cultivation for a decade had seen that drop by 3/4. That the typical Hudson River farms were now producing only 10 bushels per acre. And he saw agricultural education as a way of, A, restoring the prosperity of rural districts across the United States, and also stabilizing the rural population. And so in 1849-50, he's appointed by the governor, Hamilton Fish, to a commission that's charged with developing a plan for an agricultural college in New York State. And Downing was co-author of that report, and he hoped to establish a college that would teach students the most efficient agricultural practices, and that they would work on the farm for 3 or 4 hours every day, learning the practical side of farming as a way of supplementing the more theoretical learning that would take place in the classroom. And Downing got so excited about this that he actually sketched a plan for the college house, a dormitory, and you can see it's sort of a vaguely classical, almost vernacular classical building. It's got a central pavilion that projects forward with an arched entranceway, and on either side of it, 2 recessed panels, probably intended for sculpture, although we don't know that exactly. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And at the same time, he sent this to his longtime collaborator, architect Alexander Jackson Davis, and Davis turned it into this finished drawing, which Downing and the commission then presented to the state legislature. But the bill that they presented to the state legislature, the bill that would establish the first agricultural college in the United States, failed in large part, Downing conceded, because farmers were ambivalent about the benefits of college education. And they did not support it enthusiastically. And so the bill sort of withered in committee, got lukewarm results when it went before the floor of the Assembly, and was defeated. And Downing died shortly thereafter in a horrific steamboat accident on the Hudson River, and it left the movement without its most powerful publicist and champion. And it would be almost a decade until the emergence of Senator Justin Morrill before the battle for education, for agricultural education, returned to prominence, and this time it did so on the national rather than on the state level. This is Justin Smith Morrill. When he was a congressman, he actually introduced a bill to establish what we know today as the modern Morrill Act, and it passed both houses of Congress, but it was promptly vetoed by the President of the United States, James Buchanan, whom I'm embarrassed to say was also then the President of the Board of Trustees of Franklin and Marshall College, where I teach. Now, the Morrill Act is both pragmatic and visionary. It's pragmatic in the sense that it's going to promote agricultural education by giving away national resources. In this case, land. The United States has a tremendous abundance of land, and so the Morrill Act gives each state that chooses to become part of this program 30,000 acres of federal timberland for every senator and every member of the House of Representatives. Now, if you're a Midwesterner, you're looking at those numbers and thinking, you know, there's something that's not quite right about that. Most of the agriculture that's really the future is out here in the Midwest. And because of population, most of the benefits are going to go to the east because there's a much greater population. And the way the Morrill Act worked was that each state would then be able to sell that land. And a lot of states only got about 50 cents an acre. But they would take the income from the sale of that land and invest it in bonds, secure bonds that would return, and I wish I could get this today, no less than 5%, which would be the interest of 5% a year would be the income that provided for the operation of the agricultural colleges. The states could use 10% of that money to buy the land, but 90% of it, at minimum, had to become part of the endowment. Makes sense, huh? The act mandated that the states that accepted this public land, and I want to quote this to you because it's really powerful, support at least one college where the leading object shall be, without excluding scientific and classical studies, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life. Of course, Florida didn't qualify right away because the Morrill Act specifically did not apply to states that were then in rebellion against the national government. This was the first Civil War Congress, one of the most progressive Congresses that we've ever had. And I want to focus on two phrases. The first is, without excluding other scientific and classical studies. The Morrill Act didn't envision creating trade schools. What was imaginative about it is that it was grafting agricultural and technical education onto the classical curriculum of contemporary colleges and universities. After all, the goal of the Morrill Act was the liberal and practical education of the working classes. And the second phrase, perhaps surprisingly, is this: in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe. This is federalism at its best. This wasn't the federal government saying, we're going to do a one-size-fits-all program of agricultural and industrial education. And it gave states a series of choices. The first choice was whether or not to accept the terms of the Morrill Act. And in order to do so, the colleges had to spend some money. I know legislators love to hear that in Florida. They do in Pennsylvania also. But, you know, they had to spend money to erect buildings. Sure, they could buy the land and pay a lot of the costs of operating the college from the Morrill Act income, but they had to at least build buildings. And second, if they decide to accept the land, well then, what's the best way of going about doing it? You know, if you look at that phrase, in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe. The Morrill Act effectively gave each state the responsibility for developing an educational program for agricultural and mechanical instruction. And what resulted was a state-by-state debate and really quite novel approaches to higher education. Massachusetts, for example, divided its money between two institutions. There's one you might have heard of. It was a brand new private institution that taught technology in Boston. Didn't move to Cambridge until about 1912, but we know it today as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So Massachusetts put the mechanical or the technological parts of education in one school, and then created a public agricultural college in Amherst, out in the western part of the state, so you got geographical balance, and you got effectively two campuses to fulfill this. Maine has three prominent liberal arts colleges, Bowdoin, Bates, and Colby. Each of them vied for the largesse that the Morrill Act would provide, though the legislature eventually heeded the pleas of agriculturists and established a new institution, an agricultural college at Orono. New York, my home state, the legislature fought pitched battles for months and months and months, and finally grafted the Morrill Act onto a brand new private institution, hadn't yet opened its doors, called Cornell University. Kristen Larson's alma mater. I'm going to say very unnice things about them, but I've already warned her. In these and other states, proponents pitted public education against private education. Sectarian schools battled non-denominational colleges and universities. Communities fought each other over the prestige and the economic benefits they assumed would accrue as a result of having a new public institution in their midst. The Morrill Act was the first significant federal involvement in higher education, and predictably it spawned a vigorous, if fragmented, debate about the role of education in American society. And Frederick Olmsted became embroiled in the middle of it because he considered the importance of education to the future of the American Republic. In a series of letters and unpublished papers, as well as in designs and reports, Olmsted examined the relationship of higher education to the demands of adult life and the needs of community. And his perspective was, as you can imagine if you know much about Olmsted's career, it was somewhat idiosyncratic. He believed that the environments that we humans occupy influence our character, our development, our behavior. And that was a very common belief in 19th century America, this whole idea of a kind of environmental determinism. And he believed that environments in which instruction took place was a crucial component of the educational experience. And he believed that the new colleges and universities would need to civilize students and civilize communities to meet the needs of a modernizing nation. In April 1865, Olmsted wrote his old friend Charles Eliot Norton and said that the agricultural question is very momentous. And the issue, as he perceived it, was whether a college could be democratized, whether you could throw together the education of head workers and hand workers. We think that this is something new, but those are the terms he used in 1865. And thus far, the prospects had been bleak. When he was in California, he ran into several recent graduates of the Sheffield Scientific School, probably William H. Brewer, who later returns to Yale and becomes one of the most distinguished scientists in the second half of the 19th century. And Brewer tells him that at Yale, students in the traditional curriculum treated Sheffield's professors and students as social inferiors. You like that sign, huh? Sophia, it's terrible. And Olmsted was appalled by this, and he sought to establish ways of preventing such artificial distinctions from dividing people based on the choice of careers they were pursuing. And the one thing he came up with was throw everybody in the same curriculum for the first year. At that time, they'll forge friendships without concern for what their eventual occupations are going to be, because he believed that, as he wrote, alma mater should be the mother common to all classes. Now, Olmsted's probably, the least likely person to be concerned about higher education in the 1860s. In the middle of the 1840s, he describes college as a most grievous nuisance. He has a serious eye infection when he's a kid, so he doesn't take the usual college preparatory course. He never really goes to college. He takes several courses at Yale during his younger brother's undergraduate years. Yet as early as his 1850 walking tour of England and the continent, Olmsted begins to rethink this. He begins to realize that education has to be a crucial component of how America modernizes and how America pushes forward the kind of civilizing impulse that he thinks is so essential. But if education is going to be crucial to refining and civilizing American society, then he's got to change colleges and universities. They've got to do more than prepare young men for the professions, and they've got to do more than providing credentials as gentlemen. He believed that education had to prepare students to take leadership in civilizing their communities. And I want to show you how he does this and how that belief, that the way you civilize students and then you civilize, those students in turn raise the level of civilization in their communities, informs the campus designs he creates in the immediate post-Civil War period. And the first one is for the College of California at Berkeley. This is not a land-grant school. It's then a private college. But what Olmsted does, and I would point these things out to you, but it doesn't appear to work on this. And if I walk over there, those techies back there are going to yell at me because I won't hear. But if you can see in the upper right, the sort of right half of that plan is the college itself. This area here is for the principal buildings of the college. The B are residences, D are other college buildings. But C, and really the spine of it, is public open space. And this is a series of building lots that the college owns, and there will be a parkway that extends from Berkeley to Oakland and then by ferry connect to San Francisco. What's important in the Berkeley neighborhood plan and in these subsequent plans is that Olmsted conceived of the college as an organic entity that should be arranged to allow growth without destroying its overall beauty. And so he rejects as impractical the traditional quadrangle that comes down to higher education from its origins in the Middle Ages. And he calls instead for a picturesque design that would better harmonize artistically with the general character of the neighborhood. Now, in designing Berkeley neighborhood, Olmsted thinks about the place that colleges should occupy in a kind of continuum from urban to rural America. He doesn't much like the idea of Jefferson's academical village. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And he doesn't like colleges in cities. Colleges and universities in cities students face far too many distractions, far too much noise, far too much temptation, I'm sure, is behind it all. And colleges, by contrast, out in the middle of nowhere, lack the civilizing influence of communities. And so he says that a suburban campus like that at Berkeley is ideal because it provides for some seclusion without being monastic, and yet also engagement with a vibrant community. And of course, that's why the connection to San Francisco, connection also to the more urbane environment of the city. And then there's the matter of, well, what do you do with the kids? How do you house them? Now, traditionally, till this point in time, colleges did one of two things. Either they basically left the students on their own to find housing in communities. They did that at my college for God knows how long. Or they housed them in dormitories. And Olmsted said that dormitories are little better than large barracks and commons. He said that if the college is going to fulfill its civilizing mission, we needed to provide student dwellings that had the general appearance of large domestic houses, each of them having a common room, a dining room, and private rooms for some 20 to 40 students. Now, most university administrators today would say, well, that's a great idea, but it's economically impractical. And Olmsted's response would be, are you manufacturing graduates, or are you educating them to be members and leaders of a community? Berkeley neighborhood is important because it articulates three principal concerns. The need for an appropriate site plan that allows for the college to grow to accrete buildings over the years. It establishes the relationship of the college to the community, and it calls for a domestic scale of buildings, especially for student housing. Now, in all of this, Olmsted is drawing upon his own personal experiences growing up in New England, and he elaborates on these ideas when planning 3 land-grant colleges, 3 universities formed under the terms of the Morrill Act. And none of them are completed at all according to the plans that he sketched. The first of them was for the University of Massachusetts, then the Massachusetts Agricultural College. He goes to Amherst in 1865, and he, based on that visit, develops a plan. The trustees are so enthusiastic about his plan that no one at Amherst has ever found it. It was deep-sixed right away. And Frank Waugh, a legendary figure in the history of American landscape architecture, tried to draw what Olmsted's plan must have been. We in the Olmsted papers didn't believe it because we think that, in my reading of the text, this whole area in here was really the centerpiece, the area between the public road and the pond created in the stream. It's really the centerpiece of where those farm buildings were going to go and where the most important farm fields were going to go. And we just don't think that he actually got, we don't think there's enough information in Olmsted's report to do this kind of report anyway. Now, at the time Olmsted shows up at Amherst, the trustees have already made up their minds. They want to erect a 4-story stone building on top of a hill a good distance from the public road. As far as the trustees are concerned, that's a fait accompli. Olmsted objects to the building. It was designed by a Boston architect, Joseph Richards, and he objects to its location so far from the public road. And he questioned whether you needed a building that large, and he questioned why you would put it so far from the road. And instead, he recommends construction of 4 smaller buildings, 2 stories. Respectively, you can see there's a chemical lab and a library museum, and those would be brick or stone to be fireproof. An armory and gym, an armory and gym, and another classroom building. Probably not exactly as Waugh aligns them, but those are important. So first of all, he's calling for a much more economical building program, and he wants the principal buildings to be located near the public road. Why? In New England, most farmsteads are located on public roads. And he contrasts New England's agricultural tradition with that of the South. Olmsted knew the South's agricultural tradition very well because in the 1850s he traveled throughout the South as a correspondent, first for the New York Times and then for the New York Trib. And he published A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, A Journey in the Backcountry, A Journey Through Texas, and the Cotton Kingdom, 4 books that analyze the impact of slavery on the economy of and society of the South. It's probably why it took about 60 years before the University of Florida invited him to come down here, or invited his son to come down here. And in his report at Massachusetts, he criticized farming communities in the South and the Midwest because they were withdrawn from the public sphere. The houses were set back from the road. There were few public edifices or any public works of any kind that promoted a sense of community. And he argued that Massachusetts farmers, by contrast, were leading the drift of civilization to a higher level, and that the agricultural college ought to be part of that process. That the agricultural college ought to be located along that public road. It ought to have easy access to surrounding communities. And it ought to inculcate in its students responsibilities for the public welfare. And above all, he wanted the students to live in buildings that would promote their understanding of family life and promote their commitment to communities. He hoped that the land-grant colleges could educate sons from the surrounding communities who would not take their education and leave and go to the city, but would instead take their education and return home and work to improve their communities. And in order to create this kind of commitment, he believed that students ought to reside in dwellings possessing a domestic character, as he believed that this was important, and this is a quote, in advancing their education in the art of making a farmer's home cheerful and attractive. Now, it's a wonderful report, but whatever its merits, it worsened divisions among the trustees. D. Waldo Lincoln, one of the most powerful of the trustees, considered the report an insult, and when Olmsted got word of it, he wrote him a letter and added gasoline to the fire when Olmsted asserted that he'd gotten it all wrong, that the individuality of an agricultural college lies in its agriculture, not in its building, which is a mere piece of apparel to be fitted to the requirements of an agricultural trunk. So the trustees conveniently lost the report. They limited circulation of Olmsted's report. And in refusing to follow Olmsted's advice, Henry Flagg French, one of the leading agricultural reformers in Massachusetts, and the father of Daniel Chester French, the great American sculptor, who had been named the first president of the college, he resigned in protest. And he convinced Olmsted to make his report public, and Olmsted published it in December 1866 as a few things to be thought of before proceeding to plan buildings for the National Agricultural Colleges. Never select a short, simple title when you can have something as cumbersome as that. And then he goes to the University of Maine at Orono. Here, too, you can see a public road extending here at the south all the way up to the north. The Stillwater River is located there. The trustees had acquired 2 farms, and Olmsted said, okay, let's use the road as the organizing principle of the campus. And again, looking at the tradition of community development in New England, he says, let's take this central part of the campus, and he wants to turn it into the collegiate equivalent of a town common in New England. Whereas in a town common in New England, you locate the church and civic structures and the homes of the wealthiest people in the community around the village green. Here he wants to put the chapel and the library and the most important buildings on the campus. Locates farm fields up here, and using an existing farmhouse, locates the farm superintendent's residence here. And this actually survives in Orono. It's an Olmsted plan. The college president's house down here. And then you can see all of these small rectangles that are sites for dwellings. Instead of dormitories, he's proposing that students live in effectively what are only slightly larger than a traditional single-family home. Because this is part of the college's civilizing mission. Now, Merritt Caldwell Fernald is acting president of the university from 1868 to 71. He serves there in some capacities for 45 years, and the trustees finally impose upon him, as a very old man, to write the history of the first founding years of the college. And he does, and he says that the Olmsted plan was really ingenious in so many ways, but of course the trustees thought that in 1867 that it seemed too military. Well, the only part of it that's military is a building that doubles as a kind of place for cadets and also as the college's gymnasium, and also a parade ground, which is located opposite the village green, just on the other side of the public road. All of the plans for Moral Act or land-grant colleges included parade grounds and included a military function. Remember, they were passed by this law was passed by the first Civil War Congress in the spring of 1862. The Civil War was very much on their minds, and the Moral Act mandated military training. Fernald got it wrong. What happened was this. The initial trustees of the new Maine Agricultural College were 15 in number, one from every county in the state. They eventually selected the 2 farms at Orono, but they were so bitterly divided among themselves that they realized they could never function effectively as trustees. They went to the state legislature and said, would you accept our resignation and appoint a much smaller, more collegial body? And the legislators did. They appointed a new board of trustees of 7 people, 6 of whom were right from around Orono. And where Caldwell gets it wrong, Fernald gets it wrong, is that this new body of trustees had no ownership over Olmsted's plans. They couldn't have cared less about it. And so they followed their own inclinations, and they put up a campus that looks like hell. Bunch of tall buildings. It's hard to tell what their function is, what the relationship is to the surrounding community. And then finally, Cornell. The founding president of Cornell, one of the legendary educators in 19th century America, was Andrew Dixon White. The founder of the university, Ezra Cornell, was a pretty hard-headed guy. Yeah. That's probably an understatement, right? Andrew Dixon White brings Olmsted to campus and says, come on, you got to help us come up with a plan. Well, Ezra has already hired an architect from Buffalo, Harlow Wilcox, and Wilcox has designed, you guessed it, 4-story stone buildings, and he's determined that these are going to be built as a quadrangle. And they're going to be located on a hilltop overlooking Cayuga Lake, or as the locals call it, Cayuga, right? Kristen, where'd Kristen go? Right, Cayuga? And in your favorite time of year up there, right? Which is about 6 months of the year.
It's early June, right?
Yeah, that's no, that's late May. No. Early June, you can actually sit down by the lake. And Olmsted said, again, you don't want to build a quadrangle because it is so inflexible that it won't allow for organic growth in the future. And you don't want to build tall buildings because, I mean, they're inconvenient, they're unnecessary. But Ezra Cornell, by damn, he says, we're building tall buildings and we're building a quadrangle. And all of the trustees, most of whom are from Ithaca and most of whom are very good friends with Ezra's, say, White, we're building stone buildings 4 stories tall and we're building them as a quadrangle. Olmsted says, White, don't make the same mistake that every other college and university is now regretting. But there's nothing that White can do about it. And so he writes to Olmsted, and this is one of the lamest sentences I've ever read. He writes, if there be mistakes, we must trust to future rectification. And instead, Cornell's quadrangle, and of course this little hillock there with trees on it, that gets raised. And Cornell's quadrangle becomes a windswept tundra for much of the academic year. Now, the only civilized time to be in Ithaca extends from June till, what, early September? And after that, forget it. And then, parenthetically, Andrew Dixon White comes back to Olmsted in 1873. The still very divided New York State legislature begins a formal investigation into how Cornell University has managed the funds from the Morrill Act. Some state legislatures are still out to get Ezra because he offends a lot of people in the course of his daily life. And White asks Olmsted to become a trustee. And Olmsted says, I'm not that sort of guy. He says, and he writes to him, I am rather of the other sort, a moderate drinker, semi-profane swearer, a Sabbath cracker. So I'd dance if I had 2 legs. I'd gamble if I had brains enough. But, he says, if you make me a trustee, I promise you this. I won't crowd your campus with any more unwanted buildings, and you'll never find another man who is less likely to get up and give an after-dinner speech at Delmonico's, which was then the restaurant everybody went to in New York City. So Olmsted comes onto the board, lends his reputation to the integrity of White's administration, and he serves on the board until the tempest passes, and then he quietly resigns. How are we doing for time, Chris? All right, Olmsted does a couple of plans for smaller places at the same time. The Columbian Institute for the Deaf and Dumb in Washington, D.C., the modern Gallaudet University, and the buildings were designed by his partner, Frederick C. Withers. They're still there. Much of the campus is still there. But it's a much smaller scale. And he also does some work for Amherst College. The 3 buildings with the lines through them are the original 1821-22 buildings. Then the college builds 2 buildings, one at either end of that row. But as the college grows into the 1850s, there becomes the question of, well, now where do we put new buildings? And Amherst is organized facing west because the Connecticut River is the major transportation artery. And one person wants to put this big new building he's going to give to the college right smack in front of the original row of the signature historic buildings on the campus. So William Augustus Stearns brings Olmsted in and says, help! And Olmsted looks around and he says, you know, the whole community is being transformed by the railroad, which is arriving on the eastern edge of town. And instead of growing to the west, the whole community is going to turn around and grow to the east. And so he develops a plan which is actually carried out in which the college takes over a significant amount of land to the west, or to the east of the traditional college, and Olmsted and later his firm provide over the course of decades the kind of planning that guides Amherst's development into the 20th century. Now, the plans for Gallaudet and Amherst are nice, they're actually carried out. And this is the point where my students would say, well, Professor Schuyler, if Olmsted's planning was so important, how come nobody listened to anything he said? And to be sure, his plans for the land-grant institutions were in large part ignored. They represent a road not taken. His intent to civilize students and to civilize communities gave way to greater efficiency in housing, our much beloved dormitories, of course, which, as all of us as educators know, are a true source of real development for our students. Now, only the finest activities take place there. And his vision of organic campuses was in most cases supplanted by the time-honored but increasingly rigid quadrangle. And the result, he feared, was that campuses would not be able to grow organically, campuses that in their design could not inculcate the values of civility and community he believed that every liberally educated individual should exemplify. But as universities grew, his ideas found at least partial fulfillment. At Harvard, President Charles William Eliot established the house system. And the house system was an attempt to break down the isolation, the anonymity of undergraduate life as the institution became a modern university and the numbers of graduate students overwhelmed the number of undergraduates, by housing students in smaller, more intimate settings with real leadership provided by house masters who were faculty. And today, many colleges and universities are revisiting that idea, replacing dormitories when we can with smaller scaled houses, and also taking another page from Olmsted in emphasizing the connection between university or college and community through voluntarism. In effect, and undoubtedly, without realizing it, many colleges and universities in the last generation have taken steps that may, in part at least, fulfill Olmsted's idea of a liberally educated individual. He believed that a well-designed campus would promote, as he put it, the acquisition of the general quality of culture, which is the chief aim of a liberal education. Thank you. Yes, Bonnie.
Okay, we have some time for a question and answer. Would I guess because of the filming mechanism, if you could ask your question loudly, or if you're willing to repeat.
I'll try to repeat it.
Then that way we'll get enough time.
Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you think that what has contributed to the dehumanizing of the university could be the proliferation of online universities?
I think that's about as antithetical to what he saw as promoting community as it gets. And, you know, Olmsted doesn't plan any of the historically black colleges or universities, but, you know, one of the things that's really interesting about them is that they seem more interested in the kinds of things that he's prescribing than most of the more elect colleges. And if you look at some of the historically black colleges and universities, and you drive down the street, and the agricultural buildings are right on the street, and you get some of the technical buildings right on the street, and I'm sure that's what the state legislatures went there, saw, and turned around and left. When you get inside the campus, that's when you get the devotion to the liberal arts and humanities. And I think in many ways the scale of those colleges is much more in keeping with what Olmsted had in mind than these behemoths. Yes?
I wonder, can you elaborate a little bit on your comment about how the city evolved over time, and it seems that this idea of the park itself of the campus and the connection to Oakland, in fact, is served there. And the idea of the protection of the ecological, the stream, the strawberry.
Yeah, and when Daniel Coit Gilman becomes president of the University of California, this is before he goes on to Hopkins, he's the founding president of Hopkins, and he writes a letter to Olmsted and says, we understand you plan the campus out here and nobody seems to have any record of it, and Olmsted writes back, and then Gilman writes back and says, well, the only solution is to get you to come out here and do it right. So that he was aware of the principles of the plan. And in many cases, a lot of what Olmsted does, is predicated on what the topography is like, what the drainage is like, where the water courses are, the way modern planners think. And I think that's what's still reflected at Berkeley. Yes?
Is the University of Florida the only Morrill Act student in Florida?
There's only one per state, as far as I know.
It's peculiar that Florida A&M is so named.
And that's the
Morrill Act of 1891 stipulated that in the South, where racial segregation had to be the second school for African students. So Florida A&M is the second Morrill Act, and the other seven states also did that.
Thank you. Yes? The question is, was Stanford the embodiment of Olmsted's principles? I wish I could say yes. Olmsted does a plan for Stanford. He sends Harry Codman, his very cherished associate, out there. He tries to get Leland Stanford to adopt a plan for planting according to the climate of the semi-arid West. And the architecture is developed by Shepley Rutan, who were associates of and the successor firm to Henry Hobson Richardson. But Stanford and his wife travel a lot, and they're still grieving over the death of their son, Leland Jr., and the university is legally the Leland Stanford Junior University in his memory. So Stanford appoints Ariel Lathrop as the person who's managing his interests with the university. Lathrop's his brother-in-law. And one of the things that Lathrop does is he fires the engineer, McMillan, whom Olmsted is hired to do the surveying, to do the grading, to do all that sort of stuff, preliminary to building and landscaping. And then Lathrop convinces his brother-in-law to alter the architectural plans, to alter the landscape plans, and it's one of the opportunities that is lost as well. So, sorry. There's some evidence of Olmsted there, but it ain't great. Yes, Sophia.
Did Olmsted's plans to have students live in private houses have anything to do with our current Greek system?
They're not private houses. They're of the scale, but they are owned and operated by the universities, but on a more of a domestic scale, as opposed to those big old dormitories. So that those smaller scaled residences were part of the civilizing function of the university, whereas I think most of us would agree that those dormitories are probably decivilizing at best. Yes?
There was a display in Illinois of the impact of Lincoln on the Morrill Act. And apparently Lincoln is very interested in mechanization of agriculture. So how important was he to the Morrill Act?
You know, the classic history of that first Civil War Congress is Leonard Curry's Blueprint for Modern America, and he doesn't mention Lincoln being at all involved in the debates. Now, I've looked at the Olmsted records in great detail. I've not gone back and looked at the legislative history because that's sort of a standard reference work for the subject. I don't remember seeing Lincoln's fingerprints on it at all.
Because this display was on the mechanical, it was sort of the early development of the farm machinery industry in Illinois.
Yeah.
He was very interested in that.
Well, he made most of his money, representing railroads, I think he probably represented some of, the international, what would be, Cyrus McCormick, and he probably represented those guys before the legislature, too. But that's just a guess. Yes, sir.
Is there one college or university you could recommend to us as best embodying these principles?
Bless you. Bryn Mawr, surprisingly, is awfully good. He does parts of Princeton. He does the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, which was then affiliated with Princeton, and that campus is almost completely intact. New buildings to be, Lawrenceville School, new buildings to be sure, but very sensitively done by and large. And the firm goes on to plan campuses well into the 20th century. During the 1930s, Duke University's development that Olmsted Jr. Is involved in is either the first or second with Rockefeller Center of private sector building programs during the Great Depression. I mean, there are more than 500 plans at Duke University at the Olmsted National Historic Site in Brookline, Mass. And nobody at Duke's ever looked at any of them. Well, they don't need to. They don't play basketball. Yes?
Did Olmsted write or talk about what he meant by civilizing?
Yes. In Volume 5, we published a several hundred-page document on what he calls the drift of civilization in the United States.
Or what's wrong with everything?
No, it's actually, yeah, there's a fair amount of what's wrong. I mean, and he like many commentators, starting with Horace Bushnell, established this sort of dichotomy between barbarism and civilization. And Olmsted uses the term decivilizing for those forces that are regressive. But, he really talks very much about civilization in terms of community, and he talks about it in terms of the institutions, educational institutions, cultural institutions that, as A.J. Downing would put it, promote what he called popular refinement, an upward leveling in Benthamite terms of the population. And he sees this, and tomorrow at noon when we're talking about Central Park, I sent Sophia Olmsted's 1870 address, Public Parks and the Enlargement of Towns. And in that, he very clearly articulates the role of institutions like that, libraries, museums, other institutions, in promoting this higher level of civilization. And he sees education as really key to that. And I focused on education because it's the Moral Act today. But yeah, there's a real articulate presentation of that in Volume 5. Welcome. Yes?
Going back to this theme of the dichotomy between barbarism and civilization, which to some degree informs our own contemporary discussion about the role of the university. If we can try to relate that to the basic theme, rehumanizing the university, and also about the role of the university, whether we can use something as we think in terms of this kind of conflict between the university as an agent of change, as a civilizing element in society and education, as something that prepares citizens for democratic society, makes them to think, versus other vision of education as credentialing service or as something that is purely utilitarian, creating workers for industry and so on. How can we use some of these models to inspire us as educators as we fight these battles today when, at least according to some of us, the forces of barbarism seems to be on the ascendancy.
How do we take...
any of these really as in terms of contemporary, as a strategy, or at least to make the argument, our university was supposed to be, this was maybe, I'm just brainstorming, this was what our university was supposed to be based on.
Yes, I think...
ideals on which it was established.
If I had to articulate that, how do we get from barbarism and civilization to reaffirming the core of what our universities and colleges ought to be? What I would say is that colleges and universities are Janus-faced creatures. We look forward And our universities and our colleges, through technology, through the sciences, are reshaping the future in ways that, as a humanist, are way beyond my scope. I have colleagues who do research on pulsars, and I sat on the tenure and promotion committee, and I was dealing with these people, and I was scrambling to find information about what the hell it was these people were doing. I mean, it's mind-boggling in lots of ways. But equally essential to our role as colleges and universities is that we are the keepers of tradition. We look forward, we advance in lots and lots of ways, but we also have a foundation that is rooted in history, and that we are that Janus part of it is what provides stability as we confront change. That's my personal view of how this works. And I tell my students that, you know, madcap racing toward the future without being completely grounded in where we are today and how we got here is a very dangerous thing. I think that we need to keep very much in mind both sides of that Janus-faced appearance, that we are shapers of the future, but we are also keepers of the human condition and human traditions. Thank you, Bonnie.